I don't want to set the world on fire.
Hi everyone, this is Violet Irwin. I know it's been a long time since I've posted a video. It's been since the 4th of July actually. It's kind of too long. So, I'm back and I'll be posting more. I'm sorry that I had to take this break. I was moving and, you know, sometimes work obligations when you're an entrepreneur take away from the things that you'd rather do, which is come and talk to you guys on this fabulous YouTube channel of mine. What we're gonna do today is another installment of the Property Manifesto. Yay, I know, it's been a while. In today's Property Manifesto, I want to talk about the elephant in the room, which is, if you're a Propertarian, does that mean you're an anarchist? Or does that mean that you believe there's a role for government? Now, I'm sure that I will get plenty of hate from my ANCAP friends for this, but I just want to make clear that I still respect everyone that is an anarcho-capitalist because we have so much more in common than we have different. So I hope that for those of you who follow my channel that are ANCAPs that you'll bear with me through this explanation of why I do think that there is a role for government, especially in my Property Manifesto. So I think the best way to do this is to start with the libertarian kind of anarcho-capitalism reasoning for why we shouldn't have a government. So the non-aggression principle, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is the idea that you cannot aggress against another person. It's immoral to do that, to commit acts of aggression against other human beings. And in watching my Property Manifesto, you can see how I really have modified the non-aggression principle a little bit to be that it's immoral to aggress against the property of another human being. And the property of another human being includes not just real property and personal property, but their property of body and property of mind, which encompasses their life and their choices and all of those things. The main anarcho-capitalist argument is that if I can't aggress against property, then the government should not be able to either. And because everything the government does is aggression, therefore, we just need to get rid of the government because the whole entity in and of itself is immoral. But the issue that I have with this is that it omits self-defense, aggression and self-defense. And I would think that many anarcho-capitalists would agree with me when I say that if someone is trying to come and aggress against you, you have a right to defend yourself against them, right? If someone comes up to you in the street with a knife and tries to stab you, you have a right to, you know, stab back or shoot back or whatever you have to do to protect your life. And all I'm saying is that that applies in the property context as well. You have a right to aggress in self-defense of your property. Your real property, your personal property, your property of body, and your property of mind. In all of those instances, when someone else is aggressing against your property rights, you have the right of self-defense to aggress back. And why am I talking about all this self-defense stuff? The reason I talk about that is, I believe the proper role for government is that the government can aggress only where an individual would also have the same right to aggress. Okay? So, in the Propertarian context, that would mean that the government gets to act, because everything the government does is force, right? Aggression. The government gets to act solely in those instances where it would be okay for an individual to act with that same amount of aggression in self-defense. So let's do an example with all 4 kinds of property and where I think the government would play an appropriate role. So real property, for example. And this is something that we actually have done a pretty good job of in the United States, which is that if people are trespassing on your land or coming on your land to do harm to you or your land, you have a right to expel them from the property. Or in the case where they're trying to do you harm, you can do them harm to the extent that it's reasonably necessary to protect yourself and your property. Now, there's a lot of nuance in the law about reasonable and equal force and things like that. But my point here is, if you can expel a trespasser by force from your own property, then you also could appoint a third party to do that on your behalf. So in that instance, the government could also expel a trespasser from your property because you would be in your right to expel that same person. So where it would be okay for an individual to use force, a government entity could also use force, right? And so we can see that in real property. Now let's talk about personal property. And I want to talk about personal property, especially in terms of monies, because that's where we get into breach of contract stuff. So let's say you enter into a contract to build a house. You're going to have a house built on your property. It's going to be new and fabulous and awesome. And in the contract, there's certain monies that you have to pay for that to be done. And maybe there's milestones along the way. And let's say you've paid up all of the monies that have to be paid up in order for the whole house to be built. But it's not done yet. In that instance, that person has now taken money from you that's not theirs, right? Because that money was only supposed to be theirs on the condition that they built the house for you. So in this instance, in defense of your property, you would have every right to go and take that money back because you didn't get what you were promised out of that deal. That money is your personal property, and they now have it without any reason for it. You didn't agree to give it to them in that way. In effect, it's a way of stealing, right? A breach of contract is a way of stealing in many instances. So in that case, you could, as an individual, you would be morally justified in forcibly getting that money back. And that's why I think the court system comes into play. Because as an individual, you would have the moral authority to get that money back by force, and therefore, a government entity, you could use them as a third party to achieve the same. Which is why you'd go to a court and say, they breached this contract, they owe me this much money, I can prove it. You know, please use the hand of government to help me get my money back, because that's my personal property. And I would be morally, entitled to have it back, and, it would be ethically sound for me to use force to get it back. So that's personal property and real property. Now, in terms of property of body, this is really clear. This is why we have a Second Amendment, right? Or at least in the individual context, right? So, as an individual, if someone's trying to kill you, someone comes up with a gun in your face, and says, give me your wallet or I'll kill you, or whatever, or is just a crazy psychopath and wants to kill you anyway, or rape you or something, you as an individual have a right to defend yourself against that aggression. And so similarly, the government, a third party, if witnessing violence or if witnessing a rape, could intervene as a third party to protect that person's property of body. Because that person, that individual who's being attacked, would have the moral authority to defend themselves with force there. Okay, so that one's pretty straightforward. Property of mind. So, property of mind is where we get into freedom of religion, all this other mess. So, if someone, let's say a crazy Islamist, puts you down on your knees and says, you have to submit to Allah, or I'll kill you, you would have the right to defend your property of mind and say no, by force, and be like, get the fuck out of my face. I'm not going to say that. I don't believe that. You have the right to defend your property of mind by force. And in a similar way, equal and opposite force, right? Like if they were doing that at gunpoint, you could shoot at them, okay? Now, if they're just kind of harassing you, you probably couldn't shoot at them, but you could forcibly get yourself out of that situation. Because you're being forced to say things you don't believe, right? The non-aggression principle has been violated against you and your property of mind, right? So a government in that instance could come in as a third party and say, I'm going to protect this individual's property of mind by forcibly stopping this person from making them submit to some religion. Okay? So that's kind of the basic gist of it. Now, what that means is that we have to have the existence of a government, right? Some anarcho-capitalists will say, if you allow force to happen in that instance, then that is immoral in and of itself. But if it's immoral only to the extent that it's not in self-defense, then it really isn't immoral for a third-party actor to, use force in that same self-defensive context. And so that's where I think that the need for government arises. Because the issue is that not every individual will be capable of defending their property of body, property of mind, real and personal property. They just won't be able to. And if individuals, especially individuals who all live in the same property area, right, like in a nation, come together and like we did with our Constitution and said that as a people, we're creating this entity that as a third party can step in and use force in those instances where it would be appropriate to use force. Now, in my opinion, our Constitution is a little bit broad, right? Because it's not specific to the property rights of the body, the mind, real property and personal property. They kind of, in my opinion, the way they did the rights, it's all muddled. It's not clear that it's about protecting property rights through and through, and that you're applying property rights principles. So that's how I would want the Constitution to be more structured. But in general, to draft up a Constitution like that, and to say that the government can act in those self-defensive instances where an individual would be able to act, but they can just do it as a third party, that is totally, within the realm of the non-aggression principle to me. Because what you're saying is that a third party can act in self-defense of your property. And that's already the common law. And who among us would say that if you see your child about to be shot, that you would not have the right to use aggression against the shooter to protect that child's life? Right? Or even if it's not your child, even if it's just some random bystander that you've never met who's being beaten to death on the street because he was wearing a MAGA hat or something. I mean, it's like not even that far off considering how our country is right now. But let's say something horrible like that's happening. Some random stranger just getting the crap beaten out of him because of his political beliefs. As a third party, you have every right to intervene in that person's self-defense. Every right to do that. Because you're acting in self-defense of property, in defense of, not aggressing against. Because as soon as someone aggresses, they open themselves up to aggression, right? And it makes sense because you're the one who started it. And if you start it, there's going to be other people who now all of a sudden have the right to defend themselves and who have the right to have other people defend them on their behalf. So that is why I think that government should exist. And what I think, in a general sense, the role of government should be. Again, I'm sure I'm going to get flack from my ANCAP friends because there's just such a feeling of like the government is aggression and therefore we have to abolish it in all of its means and all of its ways. But the thing is that there are appropriate times for aggression, right? And I want to talk about Europe a little bit, just to be illustrative, okay? So like in Sweden, where there's these poor girls who have been like gang raped or whatever, or in the UK too, like in Rotherham, where there's these grooming gangs and stuff. So there's women getting gang raped, right? And because of other various issues, there's no way they'd be able to protect themselves. Like, they don't have a Second Amendment there, so, their government doesn't even acknowledge that they have a right to defend their property, right? But what I'm talking about is, in the instance of 5 men trying to rape a woman without a gun, that's one of those times where it's like, yeah, I think a third party would be allowed to use force to intervene in there, Like, that's when the police get called and the cops should be busting down doors to help save that girl from being raped, right? That's an act of aggression that's okay. It's okay to be aggressive in self-defense. So I would encourage my anarcho-capitalist friends to just think about this idea of we're having the government only act aggressively wherein it is a self-defensive act of aggression, right? Or a defensive act of aggression on behalf of some third party. And don't get me wrong, okay? the government's really bad, right? They abuse their power all the time. And that's why we gotta limit their scope as much as we possibly can. And, you know, here's something that all of us libertarians will agree on, which is that the government's really good at aggression, right? Like at killing people, hurting people, fucking stuff up, imprisoning people. That's their thing. And they do a great job with it, right? Like they woof, if you need someone killed, you know, no one will do it faster than the government, right? But it's important that we use that to our advantage, right? Because if the government's only good at aggression, which it is, then it should only be allowed to do aggression when aggression is morally justified. But I really do think that there is a role for government. And while I sympathize with the idea that government is only force and force is bad, I think that that's a little bit simplistic, because force is not always bad. Force is okay in self-defense. And if force is okay in self-defense, then if the government is limited to only using force in defensive ways, then how can that be immoral in and of itself? And I'm welcome to debate any ANCAP that would like to debate me on this. I would love to debate it, especially the open borders, freedom of movement issue. I would love to debate. Welcome me on your channel if you want, or if not, whatever. But I really think this is something that the anarcho-capitalist community could reflect on a little bit, because aggression bad, government equals aggression, therefore no government, is a little bit simple. And I know that that's not as simple as the arguments that you guys make. There's a bunch of ANCAPs out there who phrase it like that. So anyway, this is my kind of cringe video, because I really hate the government, and you know, to be in defense of them in any way is really hard for me. But I do think that they're good at forcing people to do stuff. They're great at aggression. So in my opinion, we should just have the government only do that which requires force and aggression. But with that, I will wrap up this video. Thank you so much for tuning in today and listening all the way to the end, if you made it to the end. If you like these videos, please like and subscribe below, and maybe share them with your friends if you'd like. I love you all dearly, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.
I just want to start a flame in your heart.